Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Council informational meeting. The meeting will start in 60 seconds.
Welcome to the 4 o'clock informational. Today is Tuesday, May 22nd. Call this meeting to order. We'll start with City Council open discussion. Any open discussion? Councilor Selberg.
Thank you, Council Chair. Had the privilege of attending Armed Forces Day services Saturday. Councilor Staley was there, Councilor Brecky, they were there as well. We get invited to a lot of events. And sometimes it's hard to pick and choose what all you can get to, but I always try to make a point to get to those that honor veterans and those type of programs, because I obviously think that people past and present, their sacrifice makes everything else we do possible. So it's kind of fun to go and honor them, and then I'm always particularly excited to see the young people that are there that are getting sworn in. It's nice to see when we're used to kind of that generation who's a little kind of into looking at their phones all day and kind of into me, seeing people that are stepping up and volunteering to serve their country. I hope we see more of that too. But nice service, and a shout out to all those who served. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other open discussion? Seeing none, that brings us to our, I'm sorry, Councilor Neitzer. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry, I jumped in a little late. I had the opportunity, as well as I think a few other councilors I saw on the sheet, to go to the mass fatality exercise yesterday. And I wanted to say that for me, it was one of the best things I've done in my couple of years on the council. It was right up there in probably the top 3. I learned a lot. It was really interesting. And when we talk about collaboration between units of government, I think emergency management is clear that that's where it's almost at its pinnacle, to see how they work together, and also to have the assurance that we can tell the public that they are doing these things and they're going to be ready if that day ever comes. It was really, really a neat thing to see, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you. Any others? Okay, seeing none. We'll move to our first presentation, alcoholic beverage ordinance changes. Welcome, Jamie.
Good afternoon, Jamie Palmer with licensing. I'm here today to briefly explain some of the changes that were changed during the 2018 legislative session in regards to alcoholic beverage licensing. So the main thing that will affect our ordinances is that there are several licenses that have been repealed, and they are the BW, which allows for on and off sale malt beverage and on and off sale South Dakota farm wine, packaged beer, which allows for off sale malt beverage, and packaged farm wine, which allows for off sale malt with South Dakota farm wine, which is off sale as well. All these license types will expire on June 30th. So the only license type that remains will be the retail beer license, or the RB license, which currently allows on and off sale malt beverage sales. This has been expanded in the 2018 session to also allow the South Dakota farm wine. The price will remain the same at $300 annually. So if there were license types that hold the BW, PB, and the PF, they are going to be required, if they want to continue the privileges that were granted by their license, they are going to have to apply for the RB, or the retail beer license as we refer to it. This application will be considered a new license or a new application, and they will have to submit a checklist, which they will disclose if they want on or off sale or both. They will also have to submit the application and fee, and then they will be scheduled for a notice of hearing as well as a hearing date before the council. Most of those new license applications will be coming before the council on June 19th, and that is kind of scheduled that way so that they do not have an interruption of sales for their alcohol at all, because like I said, their current license will expire on June 30th, so this will allow them to get their new license in place and issued in time for July 1. So. The agenda item, you'll notice when it comes before you, will specify whether they're requesting on or off sale. So just be aware of that. The repeal of the licenses, the repeal of the license types also created a need for us to change a section of ordinance that referred to the closing of premise. And it currently reads on sale dealers and retail malt beverage license dealers. And since these licenses are going to be repealed, there are several convenience stores, grocery stores, Shopko's, Targets that are going to now carry that retail malt beverage dealer license. So we did have to change that section of ordinance, or we're proposing a change of that section of ordinance to exempt those that are going to offer off sale only with that license. So, because right now that license type or those license types are required to flash their lights at a certain time and clear the premise. So there was a need to change that. So the other change that they proposed was the hours of operation. So all alcoholic beverage license types can now serve between the hours of 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. 365 days a year. Christmas Day will no longer be restricted. So unless the city or the municipality has an ordinance in place to restrict that. So the restrictions will be lifted. There was also changes made to the full service restaurant on sale license. Currently, the city has those available. They do sell for $260,000 with an annual renewal of $1,500. They do have to meet the 60% of their sales has to come from food and non-alcoholic beverages. And so when that price was initially set, it had to remain unchanged for 10 years. So this change in House Bill 1070 allows, after that 10-year period, there is a potential that a municipality could decide to change that price. It just can't go below the minimum of $1 per capita. So just to make you aware of that. The proposed changes that the state law is requiring us to make, I'm potentially scheduling the first reading for June 5th and the second reading for June 19th. If you have any questions, I am here to answer them, as well as Keith Allenstein.
Any questions for Jamie? Councilor Neitzer.
Jamie, I think I heard you say this, but I want to be clear. For the new license type, when it shows up on our council agenda, it will explicitly state if they're asking for on, off, or both, so we clearly see what they're asking for?
Correct, it will.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions for Jamie? Go ahead, Councilor Starr.
Thank you. Jamie, when it says under the full service restaurant, and it says it requires proof that 60% of the sales come from food and non-alcoholic beverages, how do they give us that proof, or who does the auditing, for lack of a better phrase?
Okay. And when they initially purchase it, they have to submit an affidavit that says, kind of explains their business model and that they plan to meet that. Then every year at renewal time, they actually have to submit an affidavit with documentation with the actual numbers that they have met that criteria, and that has to be submitted by their CPA or, somebody that's qualified to do so. And that information is submitted to me. and then I have to disclose that to you on renewal time. So I'll have to, say that they have met that criteria when you're voting to renew their license.
But it wouldn't necessarily be a public document then, it's just your disclosure to us that they met the requirements.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Jamie, if I could just follow up on that, what if they go below that 60%, what happens?
Then I would have to disclose to you that they failed to meet that criteria, and then according to state law, the council is not allowed to renew that license. So they would lose that license and the ability to sell alcohol.
And then if you can, who has licenses for a restaurant, full-service restaurant license? How many of those do we have in Sioux Falls?
Currently, we've sold 2, and they, Mackenzie River and Red Robin are the 2 that hold those licenses.
And then can you remind me, I see that this is $260,000. Can you remind me what we pay for, not we, a person, excuse me, pays for the regular liquor license?
A regular liquor license right now sells for $192,360.
Okay, so less than the restaurant license, but the restaurant license is unlimited, is that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Counselor Neitzert?
How long is the wait list? And if somebody would not be able to get the 60%, would they have to just go back on and go to the bottom of a wait list?
Yeah, the wait list right now is 22 people for a regular liquor license. So yeah, essentially if one of the businesses that hold one didn't meet that criteria, they lost their license, they could apply to be put on that list, but they would go to the bottom of the list.
And if somebody is an ongoing concern, and they're not a new business, do they have to just show what their sales were in the last year to get a license like this? If they, I don't know if there'd be a case where they have some sort of alcohol license and they want to switch to, the full-on one, I guess. Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
So when they apply for a restaurant license, they have to submit an affidavit that they intend to meet that criteria. And if that's your question.
Yeah,
I
think. Yep,
so
you're getting
essentially, if it's, a lot of times it's a business that may exist somewhere else, and so they submit, some records from their restaurant in Indiana or wherever it is that it is. So they kind of provide that information to kind of show that, yes, they do meet that business model here, and they intend to meet it here. So.
And one last question. So we're charging more for the license has more rules and is more restrictive than the $192,000 license right now?
That is correct, and that was set, and I don't know, I have the exact verbiage in front of me, but it was set back in 2009, and it had something to do with the last arm's length sale of a regular liquor license, and that was all verbiage in state law at that time that allowed us to set that price that way. And so $260,000 was the last arm's length sale between a period of time that they had allowed us to collect that information. So, and then we were required to keep that price for 10 years.
Okay, thanks.
Counselor Kiley.
Thank you. Jamie, kind of piggybacking off what Counselor Neitzert was asking. So let's say we have a full-service restaurant that is now denied. They've had that license, they're denied. What's the waiting period before they can reapply for the same license?
I am not aware of one. I'd have to research that, though. Just off the top of my head, I don't believe there is one. But I believe that we would have to require some significant information that has changed that in order for the council to be able to allow that.
So it's conceivable if there was a restaurant that was very close to 60%, but let's say 59.9% of their sales was from food, they could wait maybe a month, submit the proof that it is now above 60%?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to research that and get back to you on that. I don't know for sure if there's a waiting time on that. Okay. I know there are in certain licenses in certain circumstances, but I don't specifically know that one.
Which I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be able to do that as long as they can prove that they have met the threshold. But right. Good question to follow up on. Thank you.
Counselor Staley.
How often has someone been denied because of that 60% thing?
There hasn't been. We've only sold 2 since that license was put into place back in 2009, and so no.
That's a good question, because
what period of time does it have to entail for 60%? You know, I mean, let's say 1 month doesn't make it, and then the next month, I mean, who would go in there and audit that?
It's over the last year during the renewal period. It's the overall last year.
Right, but would someone have to just complain that they think this is a problem for them, or are they submitting something every year? Again, the word audit comes to mind, that somebody needs to be overseeing that, or not. But, I mean, how would you even prove it?
The two that I receive information from, one, they have to sign an affidavit, of course, to submit, and then they also submit the records from their CPA that shows, you know, this was their gross sales, this was, you know, it kind of outlines everything, so.
When they initially apply?
Yearly.
Yearly, okay. So that they're going to know it beforehand when it's coming, if they fall below, okay.
Go ahead, Counselor.
And just to follow up with that, I would think, let's say that they're denied in January, and it had been a January to January. Now in February, they find out that in the last 12 months, February, let's say of 18 to February of 19, they do meet the requirement. That there could be a possibility that they would qualify under that grounds, that it wouldn't be based on just the last 30 days, but it would still go back for a full year period, but it'd just be dated back from February 1 to the previous February 1. But I'm sure that's something that you'll still need to follow up on.
Yeah, I would. They would have to pay, of course, the license fee all over again, so I'm not sure anybody would be really willing to do that, but, but yeah, I will research that question and get back to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move to the next item. Diane Best to discuss House Bill 1172. Diane, welcome.
I'm going to wait for the guy that runs the PowerPoint best to pull it up. There we go. Thank you, Jim. Diane Best, Assistant City Attorney. I know most of you. I've worked on open meetings issues in my prior employment with the state, and I've worked on open meetings and public records issues actually for most of my career, including here with the city. I've been with the city for 4 years. I was approached to provide some background and review of House Bill 1172. House Bill 1172 was passed by the 2018 legislature. The legislation deals with public comment at public meetings. Pretty basic. Public comment is already held in a number of public meetings. This elaborates or expands on what public comment is provided for at what meetings. My comments don't involve any change to the existing public comment period at your regular council meeting. The council, I think there's little dispute that the council provides for ample and vigorous comments at the regular Tuesday night meetings. In fact, the legislation I will describe expands public comments into other council meetings as well. With that, I'll get started by telling you what the background is on House Bill 1172. It has nothing to do with the city of Sioux Falls and its practices. It's not targeted at that at all. What happened was a legislature brought this matter to the South Dakota legislature to get a change in practices that she saw that were happening at a school board meeting in West River, part of South Dakota. She attended a school board meeting with a constituent, showed up at the meeting. There was no agenda, no public comment. The school board actually went into executive session, and then its practice was to have its executive session in the meeting room, and the attendees were required to leave the meeting room. So they're out in the hallway. The board then concludes its executive session and either reconvenes or doesn't reconvene, it's not clear, but it leaves through a side door, and the legislator and the constituent were not ever able to provide public comment or to really understand, even when the why public comment was not allowed. And of course, that's an extreme example. Why? It's a violation of the open meeting law not to have an agenda. It's a violation not to post it 24 hours in advance. It's not clear whether the reasons were given for the executive session. So probably, at least the way it was described to the legislature, probably a poster child for what to do wrong. But the legislator was present, so in addition to, rather than seeking enforcement against that particular school board, the legislator went back and looked, isn't public comment allowed at public meetings? Because a lot of people think that that is the law in South Dakota. And it really isn't. The open meeting law provides for posting notices and those sorts of things that I just talked about. But in South Dakota, it's an accepted custom and practice to provide for public comment. And of course, with this body, it actually was incorporated into city ordinance for its regular meetings. So House Bill 1172 came to the legislature. It is a new sentence in the existing open meetings law, SDCL 1-25-1. Simply says, the chair of the public body shall reserve at every official meeting by a public body a period for public comment limited at the chair's discretion, but not so limited as to provide for no public comment. So how does that change existing law? As indicated, it requires public comment at meetings. We already do that at the regular meeting. It applies the requirement to all official meetings of public bodies that are subject to the open meeting law. It provides for discretion by the chair, and it recognizes that the time available may require limiting the time for comment. So, what does limiting the time for comment mean? There was some legislative committee discussion on that, and it's apparent that the reference to limiting the time at the chair's discretion was intended to apply to limiting the total amount of time for comment and or the time for each participant. And the idea, I think, was to try to let the local chair have discretion rather than the legislature dictating. Everybody has to provide 35 minutes. That's how it is. Because in some local government meetings, there's nobody there to talk. What are you going to do for 35 minutes? I mean, so the whole idea was to be practical and let the local bodies provide for guidelines with the chair to actually make the decision. There was quite a bit of talk at the legislative committee meetings about special meetings, working sessions, or other limited purpose meetings. What if we have a meeting just to hear a report? Do we have to provide for public comment then? And by and large, the committee members of the legislative committees considering this looked at that and my sense is that they felt that obviously because they passed the law that it was appropriate even when there is a working session, if a quorum's present of the public body, even if there's a limited purpose meeting, like these informational sessions we're at today, that the comment period would apply, but the comments were variously stated to basically say that the comment period was presumed that it would apply to the topic at hand and also stated that they're key to the specific deliberative process at hand. That public comments actually aids a great deal in decision making when the comments are made to the topic at hand. So, who does House Bill 1172 apply to? It applies to all entities subject to the existing open meeting law. Any association, authority, commission, committee, council, task force, so on, appointed by statute, ordinance, or resolution. That covers a lot of ground. And then it applies to those entities if they're vested with authority to exercise any sovereign power. Well, what's sovereign power? The legislature did not define the term sovereign power in the open meeting law, but the legislature has variously defined sovereign power, and the courts have defined sovereign power. So I put together a slide of some examples. I mean, sovereign power really means, is the public body at hand charged with some aspect of governing people or running the government? So some examples are very clear: to levy and abate taxes, regulate utility rates, budget public funds, issue government contracts, enact ordinances. Those are the kind of things. The government. So if you're exercising sovereign power, you're taking action as a government entity. So that's really all it amounts to. Still covers a lot of ground for who is a public body and who is subject to the open meeting law and now subject to 1172. So that brings us to City of Sioux Falls. All official city council meetings where a quorum of the council is present currently comply with the open meetings law. They're subject to the open meetings law, and they're subject to House Bill 1172. All boards, committees, task forces created by law that exercise sovereign power also are subject to the open meeting law, currently comply, and will need to comply with House Bill 1172. I've given an example, would be the zoning and planning. The other thing is that we have a good number of advisory committees and task forces that do not exercise sovereign power. They have the opportunity to use House Bill 1172, but it is not required by law. In fact, they're not required to comply with the open meeting law, but they, in many cases, advisory committees and task forces actually do provide an agenda. They post it 24 hours in advance, and many of them already provide public input. But there are various committees and task forces out there. But I just point this out that if there is a council advisory committee or an advisory committee operating under the City of Sioux Falls at all, technically, if they don't exercise sovereign power, they technically don't have to comply with the open meeting law, and would not have to allow for public comment. I would give, a good number of the public bodies that are under, that do operate under the City of Sioux Falls already provide a significant amount of public comment. And so, this bill really wasn't directed in any way at the City of Sioux Falls. As you know, it's a West River issue, but then we need to look forward and say, well, how do we implement this? Can we use this to our advantage to actually expand public input, provide an opportunity for people to speak? Well, so I put together a slide of implementation, and they're just my thoughts about going forward. Regular council meetings already provide a period for public comment. For informational meetings, working sessions, and special meetings of the council, the chair must provide a period for public comments. The council will need to consider whether to adopt guidelines so that that period is consistent from meeting to meeting, or should it be different depending on the topics at hand. There's guidelines to adopt, but ultimately it's the council chair's determination on how to deal with that on a case-specific basis. And then the guidelines ought to, at least I'm getting this out of the legislation and the legislative debate, ought to provide a vehicle for the council to engage the public in the topic at hand when it comes to these special meetings and informational meetings. In other words, not only get the public comment, but really have an opportunity to engage the public and use that comment. And then finally, as far as implementation, I mentioned this business of advisory committees. In looking at this, should they change their practices if they don't allow public input today? And if they should change their practices, then there's a question of determining whether uniform guidelines should be implemented for those advisory committees. So as you can tell, I'm here to report on recently passed legislation. I'm not here with some idea in mind on what specific things you should do for public input, but I'm here to tell you that, of course, you have to comply with the newly enacted statewide law. And it's, like as I indicated, it's one sentence, it's easy to read. So I don't have many slides on it, and I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions? Councilor Neitzer.
Okay, so I followed this bill and other bills as it went through the legislature, and I may, and it's fine, I may figuratively take a bullet for saying this, but I'm going to say it. I think it was one of those things as I followed it, and I listened to the committee hearings, and I don't think this was very well thought out. I think it was wonderful intentions, but it's going to have unintended consequences. I think the words that came to my mind were sloppy and moronic the way it was written, and I'm just going to say it. I'll just give an example. The Zoning Board of Adjustment, they exercise sovereign power, correct? They would be under this purview, I think.
Yes.
That was a board I sat on. When we sat on the Zoning Board of Adjustment, we have very limited roles. We're citizen members. We can't change legislation. We can't do anything policy-wise. All we have in front of us is the thing that we have in front of us, which is a variance. So potentially, you could have a public input comment period where people could conceivably come up and, let's say, if you don't set the rules properly, rail on the zoning enforcement officer and complain about how they got a ticket for offense or whatever perceived issue they have with the city, or rail on the zoning ordinance and say, I don't think we should have fence laws. And these volunteer members are sitting there. They have no power to change that, and they're going to be subject to sit and listen to, diatribes possibly. So I guess that's where and I'm not necessarily, you don't even have to comment, but that's just from my personal experience. I could see that being a problem. One question I do have is it says at the discretion of the chair. The other thing too is as you read that, it's interesting they didn't say at the discretion of the body. I mean, mechanically, what is that going to mean for, because that puts the chair in a really bad position, conceivably, if you don't do it right. Because then people are fighting about why is the chair getting to set the rules, and so how do you handle that?
So, well, good question, because it does say at the discretion of the chair. So left alone, the chair could, on their own, if they wanted to, say, my rule, 10 minutes every time, see ya. Or I'm going to rule differently from time to time. Now, I'd venture to say that most governing bodies have significantly more collaboration than that, and I trust that this one does as well. But certainly when you get to governing bodies that have a large number of meetings and want some consistency, one thing that the governing body could do is to provide some guidelines, and then the chair does, the way this bill is written, has authority and discretion to determine whether to follow those guidelines, but there would at least be guidelines to provide some kind of sideboards on what the public can expect when they come to meetings.
So if I could we maybe update by resolution our operations manual and lay out what the guidelines are, and then in that would at least take it. I mean, the chair still is the chair, but then it wouldn't be arbitrary where on any given day a chair just, 5 minutes of public input. We as a body could make that determination and fix the rules that the chair has to. Would that comply with state law, do you think?
I think so, as long as it's guidelines and the chair has the discretion.
Okay, and then one other question, and I'll defer. So it's where policy is formulated or discussed or something like that. So let's say that we publicly notice, I don't know, a council dinner or whatever. I mean, or publicly notice some awards banquet that we're going to, because there's multiple of us, and one of us slips and starts talking about policy, some policy. Are we going to have to make an announcement at a microphone that, okay, whoops, we got to have public input, otherwise the chair of the council is going to be subject to a Class 2 misdemeanor?
Well, you know, that is a difficult matter because technically you are not conducting an open meeting if you're at, what was it, a dinner?
Sure,
Right.
yeah.
Unless you're talking about official business. So if you start talking about start talking about city business, you have converted it. If you have a quorum present, you have converted it into a public meeting of the body at which official business is discussed. You have to follow the open meeting law, and you have to allow now for public input. But having said that, I know that I've obviously given this speech many times in my career, but there is a perception, I think, that public bodies, when they gather, always talk about public business, and not their children, and not watching the football game, and that sort of thing. So there is a perception out there, and but if you're convening a group just to eat and visit with one another about social events of the day, you're not holding a public meeting, and you don't run afoul of any open meeting concerns.
But okay, so in closing though, I mean, again, somebody slips and start talking about pool rates, does that mean that the chair at our council dinner, if it's past July 1st, could serve 30 days in jail for a violation? I mean, it's an extreme example, but I mean...
Technically, if the body engages in discussion about public business and has not posted an agenda and is not provided for, or has not provided for public input, technically that could be a violation of the open meeting law. Now, how they're handled, of course, is, yes, you're right, there is a criminal penalty, which I've been on a couple of task force dealing with this, and it's pointed out repeatedly that those are not prosecuted. In fact, I looked one time and was unable to find any prosecution at any time in South Dakota for that offense. But they would go to the Open Meeting Commission, which is a quasi-governmental state agency, and that commission has very limited authority, but it does have authority to issue a reprimand, not a civil penalty, but a reprimand. And of course, those reprimands smart because they're very public. But that's probably the penalty that would occur if there was a violation. So I guess I would caution talking about government business at these social gatherings. But I do think that public bodies have the ability to gather or I shouldn't say the members of public bodies have the ability to gather and socialize, and they're not restricted from socializing so long as they don't talk about public business. Or if they are going to talk about public business, they need to comply with the open meeting law. But I'm probably going on in answer to your question.
Mr. Selberg.
So, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to clarify, like for the meetings we're talking about, I mean, obviously we already have public input at council meetings.
Yes.
You say that advisory committees don't have to have public input. Now, advisory committees in regards to us, that's audit, fiscal, land use, operations, public services, correct? Those are all advisory committees?
That's correct. I've actually attended a number of those meetings over the last 4 years, and I've also read minutes of those meetings, and from time to time they allow for public input.
Yes, and I know we have. I'm just saying that by this law.
By this law,
It isn't saying you
They-
have to.
I don't think that would change, the council would not have to change that practice because they are advisory, but if they wish to change that practice, they
So we're pretty
certainly
much
could.
narrowing it down on disregard to our informational meetings are what will fall within this new law, pretty much, right?
It would be any meeting where a quorum of the council itself attends. So it would be informational, working sessions, special meetings, or if you called a quorum together or the body together to hear some special report or something like that, which I guess that would be a special meeting. So the public comment would apply to any of those circumstances.
Okay, just trying to kind of define it again, what all it's pertaining to and what'll be different, so, thank you.
Counselor Kiley.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to address some of Councilor Neitzert's questions regarding, well, I guess really, first of all, I'm glad I'm not the chair of a committee any longer. But secondly, to address the need to revamp our policy and procedures manual. Our policy and procedures manual presently states that we will follow Robert's Rules of Order unless otherwise specified. And in this particular case, to address one of his specific questions, if the chair decided we're going to not allow longer than 60 seconds or whatever the case is, public input, we could challenge the ruling of the chair, and a majority of this body could overturn the chair's decision.
The state law provides that the discretion is the discretion of the chair and does not provide additional comment about Robert's Rules of Order or parliamentary procedure. And of course, state law, it trumps city ordinance. Having said that, I hope you're talking about an example that we never see. I think if you have guidelines, you're going to maybe have some consistency there or not.
Well, that would be very far-fetched, even if the chair did rule that way and then it did not take place. I can't see, but from what you're stating, it's... Well, then I go back to what Councilor Neitzert stated, that it seems like this has been very poorly thought out and put in place. So my other question, too, with our informational meetings, we do have a quorum, but typically we do not vote on any issues, so we don't have sovereign power in these informational meetings.
Right.
So can you address that?
Sure, I can. The governing body as a whole has a great deal of sovereign power. So this law doesn't say you only have to take public comments at those meetings where you exercise your sovereign power, or you only have to comply with the open meetings law when you exercise sovereign power. It says those bodies that have any sovereign power must comply with the open meeting law and must comply with House Bill 1172.
Quite frankly, I agree with that, because we're going to hear a lot of information that we could use as a later date when we are exercising that sovereign power. And the task force on annexation, which I chaired here this past year, I do not believe, and Mr. David, you could correct me, did we pass a resolution to form that task force? That was a task force that was just formed in name only. Wasn't by ordinance, wasn't by resolution. We went ahead and held public input at the end of the meeting anyway, and on one occasion, even though the meeting was scheduled to be over at 7, we continued until 8:15. But what about a task force that is formed in that fashion and does not include a majority or a quorum of council members?
Well, going back to our definitions, what we look at is it would have to be a task force that is created or appointed by statute, ordinance, or resolution So let's assume it was, because I don't recall either, quite honestly. I don't think it was, but maybe it was. It would apply to them if they were vested with authority to exercise any sovereign power derived from state law. Did they pass rules?
No, we did not. And in this case, we had to report back to the full council, which then made the final decision. And again, I'm not suggesting that, obviously, because we went through and had public input. My way of thinking is that's one of the reasons why you form a task force, to gather that kind of information so you can make sound decisions to forward to the full council. But it's questions that are going to come forward.
And that is the interesting thing about this bill. It requires public comment at all these meetings, and a good number of the bodies we have, whether they're subject to the open meetings law or not, are created precisely to gather and engage, you know, so they're already there. So.
Thank you, Diane.
Councilor Brecky.
Just a couple questions. My understanding, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, we're a home rule charter form of government, and our charter clearly sets out the council as having full legislative power.
Right.
And so that includes our ability to set our meeting agendas and govern them, choose to govern them by Robert's Rule of Procedure. And my understanding is the mayor, which is our chair of our governing body in those meetings, has a limited role on the council, you know, for tie-breaking vote and for veto power only. And when I read this, I think this is giving the chair under our charter more power than he has under our charter. And so I question, you know, if it conflicts with our charter. And the question I have in that vein then is this construed as a prohibition? Because the state can only limit our powers under home rule by passing a strict prohibition. And I'm wrangling with that question, because if it's not a prohibition, then our charter would prevail and we wouldn't have to follow it.
Well, the mayor presides over the regular city council meetings, which is a well-established public input process that is already provided for in city ordinance. So
he chairs the meetings, but subject to the rules that are adopted by the council, which are either put in ordinance or resolution.
Right.
And this is giving him a power, in addition to that he's not given under the charter. So I realize that's kind of a brain teaser, but I think we got to look into that a little more carefully.
So you are requesting that the city attorney's office look at a conflict between this law and the mayor's charter power?
Well, I am, because I don't like the state, giving the mayor more, because all of a sudden it's given the mayor power to rule over our meetings, and that's a legislative power that we have as council members. We get to direct the conduct and the content of our meeting agendas, and the rules that we're going to provide, that are going to govern us. So I'm just wondering about the state being able to do that.
Well, there are a number of cases that deal with the home rule charters and the conflicts between, or not conflicts, but how you would interpret home rule charters when they deal with various state laws. So we can look at those.
Just like a hypothetical, say the mayor wants to shorten the length of public input, but the council wants to increase the length of public input. I mean, I believe under our home rule form of government, that's the council's task. I mean, they have the authority to do that. And so I do see a conflict here.
Well, as I reported to you, this statewide law that was passed in 2018 was intended to address a wide range of different kinds of governmental entities throughout the state. And so I'm reporting to you that it says that the chair has the discretion. I have not studied the precise issue of the interplay between a state mandate versus a state prohibition on the charter. Yeah. But that's certainly something we can look at. Yeah.
I think we should.
A good number of these committees, commissions, and councils will not have those issues because the mayor will not be presiding over them, so.
Yeah, I'm guessing they didn't consider that when they passed this legislation
Oh,
either.
I'm sure not, I'm sure not.
Counselor Staley.
Diane, thank you for looking into this. And also, I want to thank you for your responsiveness to me in the past when I've asked for some information. You've been very respectful and prompt. Thank you. So when it comes to socializing, I thought that anytime we got together with more than a quorum, that we had to notice that as a public. So are you saying that we could feasibly come together for some social thing, all of us, and not notice that? And then we just say to each other, well, we're not going to mention anything about city council stuff. I didn't think that was even...
It's difficult because you will have the appearance that you are not noticing meetings and that you are conducting the public's business in private, and you never want to have that
Really wouldn't want,
perception,
exactly.
let alone violate the law. So it's always best to provide those notices. Now, it's sort of out of your control if you're all at, and I've used this example in speeches elsewhere, if you're all going to go to the state A basketball tournament, you're not going to be talking about, I would hope you're not going to be talking about city council business while you're watching the basketball.
But we all wouldn't be gathered there as
But you'd be all in the same room.
Yeah.
And you're probably not going to have an agenda for that, but you're not there for official business. So there's some, I think the law is probably pretty practical in that regard. You have to take it by case by case.
And as long as we're talking about open meetings, do you know what Rapid City has implemented for their city council with their cell phones during the meetings? I believe they were here for the municipal league last year, and we taught they do not allow cell phone usage during their meetings because because if I'm communicating, if we have conversations back and forth with council members, that would be like me taking Kurt in the back room and talking with him during the council. And maybe that's not. I mean, apparently, they construe that as not being upfront and open with everything that's happening, but that. You're not familiar with that?
I know that there has been something in the news media about it, and I have not followed it closely.
So let's come back to, did we say at the 4 o'clock we are going to be having public input then? Is that where we're going?
Well, the new law requires you to start doing that effective July 1.
And I will say personally, I think that's great. I think hearing more from the public is going to be better. So,
and I wanted to make sure I understood your question for informational for this.
This
body.
4
Yeah,
o'clock
right.
time,
Yep.
exactly. Yes. So then I also, and I know that there was a little misinformation today. I think about the 7 o'clock. That this was somehow going to affect 7 o'clock. Not to say that our 7 o'clock public input isn't on the chopping block or maybe going to be moved around. It could be happening. So I think it's good to start talking about that now. But you have sovereign power here. And you have things like issue liquor licenses, zoning, utility rates, contracts. Now, I will tell you that in our consent agenda, we do have contracts that get thrown in there sometimes, and there has been a lot of dispute as to whether we are to allow the public to come up and comment during the consent agenda time. Okay, so am I going to be reading this right, that we're going to need to open that up to say we can allow public input then?
Well,
And or liquor licenses, we generally don't allow the public to come up and make comments when we're approving liquor licenses during the meeting.
well, I think there's a little bit of apples and oranges there with due respect, and maybe I can kind of, if I was a little misleading, I apologize for that. The sovereign power issue comes up only if you have sovereign power, you're subject to the open meetings law, and you need to provide a period for public input at your meetings. That doesn't mean that you have to provide public input as to specific items where none is warranted. You have to provide a period for public input. So you're already doing that at your regular meetings. It seems like to me, but
We are doing it or we are?
you are providing for public input at your regular Tuesday night meetings. You are
For people to speak to these issues. you know, let's say if someone has a concern about an alcohol issue, or if they have a concern about something in the consent agenda, right now, the only time we have to hear from them is at the beginning of that public input time, so that we can hear their concerns and help that information to help us make a better decision when we're voting. Same thing at issue is the first reading, because we have first readings. The only time people can address that issue is during our public input time at the beginning of the meeting, because we do not allow for public input at the first reading itself. So you're saying, I hear you saying that public input at the beginning of our meetings is really what is keeping us in compliance with what this is saying.
Yeah, House Bill 1172 provides that the chair must provide for a period for public comment. Now, as indicated, is it the chair or is it the governing body when you come to a chartered municipality? Regardless, today, your regular meetings, a public input period is allowed.
Any other questions? Councilor Naitzer?
Yeah, I had a couple of things, but I did want to kind of tag off of what Councilor Staley was talking about, because I think it's a really good question. So I think what you were trying to clarify is that the law does not say that every agenda item where we exercise sovereign power, we have to take public input necessarily. We just have to provide a input period at each meeting that we have, where we have a quorum.
That's how I construe this new sentence in the South Dakota law.
And I want to be careful. I don't want to get into any debate about whether one should move input at 7 to the beginning or the end. But based on state law alone, it's pretty silent and it gives us latitude. I would think by law, I'm not saying we should, but that you could move public input to the end of the meeting, to the beginning of the meeting, to the middle of the meeting, whenever on the agenda you want it, just by state law. Is that fair to say? As long as it...
Well, I'll put it this way is, I've been with the city of Sioux Falls for 4 years. Before that, I was involved with working on open meeting issues throughout the state, and there is a wide variety in what municipalities do for public comment. And some of them it's a pretty short amount of time. Some of them it's after, oftentimes it's after the rest of the agenda. There's a wide variety. I don't think any of those entities are violating the open meeting law. I think it really is there's no set rule of thumb on that.
So the time of the meeting is really our discretion, whatever we decide. Now, I do want to say, now, since I kind of railed on it on the beginning, one really positive benefit that I thought about is that informational meetings, a lot of times we're hearing about something that's going to be coming to a first reading. So if we do it right, then we allow public input. Now the public gets to engage us really early in the process. They could hear an item early, and rather than having to wait for second reading, now they can come up and they could talk to us about it. And like the alcohol one that Jamie just presented to us, somebody could get a bug in our ear really early before we've thought about it and kind of move down the line. So I think that's if it's done properly. And that leads to my final question. At least with constitutional law, it's usually time, manner, place restrictions that you can set. So could we establish rules, in the operations manual that could set maximum number of minutes total for speakers at an informational meeting, maximum number of minutes per speaker, and so those two when in the meeting? And then the last thing would be, could we say for 7 o'clock stays no holds barred, but for other meetings like 4 p.m., it has to be something that was discussed at that informational meeting. It can't be on just anything under the sun. Could we restrict the subject matter?
The short answer is yes. You can do those things. The longer answer is we get back to this discretion of the chair. And so that's why I would characterize it as guidelines for the discretion of the chair, subject to, of course, what Councilmember Brecky's talking about, any limitations or authorizations by the city charter. But having said that, beyond that, there's nothing in the open meeting law, and certainly nothing in this House Bill 1172 that would prohibit or restrict this limiting individual time, limiting total time, that sort of thing, no.
Okay, so I'm just going to throw this out for the council. I think the clock is ticking until July 1st. Typically, you know, the manual would be updated by the operations committee. I think this is too important to just send off to one committee with 3 or 4 people. I think we ought to do something like a working session where we talk about this, come to some agreement, and we bring a resolution forward that we all agree to, and we vote on and update our manual. Because if we get to July 1st and it's simply a matter of the wild, wild west where the chair just gets to, every chair at every particular meeting says, oh, I'm going to do 5 minutes today. Oh, I'm going to do 15 minutes next week. I think it would be good if we come to some consensus and we agree on it, we codify it, the rules are set forth by the whole council to the chair, and that takes it where it isn't just one person, because I don't want to put the chair in the position of having to make calls like that and take a bullet for it, so, and just have an arbitrary thought. That's not for you, that's for the council. So.
Councilor Staley.
Diane, you referenced municipalities and elected bodies, how they handle public input, where in the meeting. Can you tell us with our county commission, Minnehaha, and the school board, where the public input is? I know the answer to that.
Good. Good.
Yeah, the school board is at the beginning, unless it's an agenda item, and then the county commission is, I just spoke to the county commission, and it's very much towards the beginning as well.
I know I have listened to, been at meetings of the county commission and listened to their televised meetings, but I couldn't offhand recall where the public comment period was, so thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I have a few comments. Councilor Brecky.
I was just going to comment to Greg's suggestion. Since you have a standing committee, which is your operations committee, it falls within this purview, I agree with you that something should be done, you know, before that July deadline. But why not run it through that 4 recommendations and then have a working, you know, let that act as your sieve a little bit, and then run it through that with recommendations to the full body at a working session. That was just my thought, my 2 cents, and that way, you know, you could do it with a smaller group and then kind of get the input from the full group, and then have the full dialogue, so that when you actually brought it forth, you know, for a vote and put it into ordinance or into a resolution or rules, then you'd have the full body's input on that.
I could go either way. I will just say historically that there has been concern that the operations committee may be making decisions and then it's partway down the line. I'll just put it that way, and that it might be better if the entire. I totally understand it would normally go there. I'm just going to throw it out. We can go either way. It's a discussion for the council, but that there would be that sensitivity that decisions about something so important would be made by a minority. So I'm trying to just respect that.
Madam Chair, and then also in having it done that way, you're also allowing the public to hear the ground level discussion. And I think that this is an important enough thing that we need to be doing this in full view from the very start with everybody involved, in my opinion.
Thank you. I will add, I would agree that I think that the full council should be doing it at a working session somewhere along very soon. It is very time sensitive, and even if it's not 100% passed in place, we can still honor whatever it is that we want to do, because it is so time sensitive. A couple points that I do want to make is public input doesn't just happen at council meetings, committee meetings. It happens everywhere, and so people have the opportunity to engage us via telephone, email, at the soccer field, at the grocery store, wherever we are. That public input, I would say, takes place more outside of these walls of this building than even in here. And while it's very, very important and we need to honor and uphold that, I do think it's important that we
are available and we have that public input continue outside of this equally as important. It is my desire as well for us to create that framework and formulate that as a whole group, not as a chair. I think that if you read the law, the intent was to allow some local control as far as letting the chair decide, but I don't think they really thought through what that meant, and that we as a whole really should be forming what works best for this body. As far as how other boards do it outside, we can have those conversations, but I don't know if we can do that as well, but we'll continue those conversations. I have been talking to Yvonne with Municipal League as far as if we need some clear clarification with this to making sure that we're not putting ourselves in a pickle for any particular missteps that we make through this and honoring the intent of it. So I'll continue to do that. We have a board meeting with them June 13th, but we'll continue to engage her. I know we don't take a vote, but it sounds as if we certainly need to move this forward and doing something. We'll work together with Diane and Jim and try to get something scheduled, hopefully next week, and honoring that time. I don't know what that will look like. I know we're all very busy, but I hope we can all make it happen. And then we'll also discuss, I know that during our technology conversation, we talked about if we want to record those working sessions, that we can move this setup in here and we can record it. That's something that I think that we should work through with staff as well. If we do want to have it in this meeting and have it more informal with moving the chairs, we can do that as well.
Yeah,
Jim.
Madam Chair. Would next week Tuesday work out? It is typically your day off. It is the 5th Tuesday of the month. It may be the opportunity to get everyone together for a working session in this room. Is that the desire of the City Council?
I think that we all reserve our Tuesday nights for this, and while we enjoy the night off, I think it's too important to not have that meeting, and so that would probably be the easiest than trying to figure out if we can do it Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever. So I think we can tentatively shoot for something like that unless anyone has any major objections. But I hope that we can then communicate it with the public and make sure that they're invited as well. Go ahead, Nathan.
Would we be talking about like a 4 o'clock, something like that? That would work best.
That's usually when we meet, so keep it consistent with that.
Sometimes working sessions are earlier in the afternoon, but I am booked a little bit.
Yeah.
If it was.
Maybe Jim can send us just a consensus as far as what our schedules allow, if we can meet earlier or not. I know everybody works outside of this. So we'll move forward with a working session for next week, it sounds like. And we invite the public, and Diane, we appreciate all your feedback and input as we move forward to making sure we're honoring the intent of what this law is. Thank you for your time. Next up on our agenda is the Public Safety Facilities Study Report. Thank you for your patience. There's so many of you here today, so.
Council Chair and members of the council, my name is Rick Kuehl. I'm an architect with WSKF Architects. I think out of respect for your time today and also for the content that's really important in terms of tonight's presentation, I'm going to make my comments very brief. What you see is the prime members of the team that were put together, myself, Tommy Abercrombie, Mike Montgomery, and Robbie Varick. Each of the team members that you see there are bringing respective talents and resources to the study. As you may or may not know, this has been a study that's been in process since May of last year. That has, with this presentation, we're hoping to bring to fruition the study and the information that's I think you've received from staff. The full committee, or the full team, design team, if you will, or study team, is made up of not only the 4 members that I showed you earlier, but also mechanical engineers, civil engineers, as well as aviation consultants that represented the entire team. For myself, public safety is what I do on a daily basis. Fire, police, EMS, 911, design facilities is kind of what I do. And it's been my distinct pleasure and honor to have had the opportunity to work with the city of Sioux Falls as well as the fire and the police departments, as well as city staff. It's been a great experience for me. Tommy Abercrombie and Mike Montgomery are both career firefighters, and so they bring to the study and this process some insights that aren't just gleaned necessarily as a consultant to the industries, but also they've lived it. So very happy to have had both Tommy and Mike to be a part of this process and participate in this. The challenge to us was listed in 4 objectives that are outlined in front of you. So Tommy's going to speak to objective number 1, which is the public safety master planning for the fire training facility. Objectives 2, 3, and 4, Mike is going to address, which 2 is obviously current station placement and the utilization of stations. Delivery of fire services is something that we were asked to analyze and make recommendations on. And finally, the police report to work as well as evidence holding was the 4th objective that was placed in front of us in terms of assessments of whether that should be something that we would recommend to the city of Sioux Falls or not. If it's okay with you, what we would really like to do is to hold questions to the end, if that's okay with you. And then we'll address your questions at the end of the presentation. And so with that, I'm going to invite Tommy to come forward and talk about the fire training facilities.
Thank you. Hi, Tom.
Hi. Thank you. Just a real quick, a little bit about my background. I am a career firefighter. I have a PhD in architecture, and my line of inquiry is on the design of public safety training facilities. So all of my approach is about what are we doing, and I can tell you that my interest in that, not only being a firefighter, was I went to a lot of really bad training sessions. And so looking for a better path to take care of that. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is what we've learned over the years about how quality training gets conducted and how it impacts the community in there. I'm going to go really quick because we have a lot of information. I apologize for that. And you're going to get a lot of information from Mike. So hopefully feel free to ask us questions afterwards, but there's going to be a lot that we'll cover very briefly in this. The challenge was, where are we now, where do we need to be, and how do we get there? So looking at the master plan process, we did 2 things. We did a facility assessment. Midwest Engineering did a facility assessment of all of the structures, including the firing range, that are out on the site. And then we looked at what are the things, minus what we have currently, what would we be doing if we were doing it like we know we should? And that involved the things that you see there. And one of the things I want to point out there that's a really big part of our process is the target hazard study. So what we did there is we had all of the rank and file personnel throughout the departments, both police and fire, go out and take pictures and identify places that give them pause, that are concerns for them, either by their frequency, the type of structure it might be, barriers to entry to there, high frequency type calls, low frequency, high risk type calls. But what we wanted to do is not get this picture of what the people in charge think's going on. What are the people that are doing the work? What do they see is going on? And some of the photos that you'll see here of the community are based on things that we see, like your downtown area there, some of the unique things where you have high value historic structures, you have commercial with residential above that that's happening more, and those provide unique challenges that were clearly identified by the rank and file. So part of the assessment was the facility assessment of the current structure, built in 1978. I can tell you, no matter where you were, Sioux Falls or any place else, if you said, I'm going to build a burn building, I'm going to attack it with heat, I'm going to cool it off rapidly, I'm going to bust things down in there, and I'm going to expect it to last 50 years, well, we would laugh because it doesn't happen. And so what's happening out there is what we would expect to see with the kind of abuse these type of facilities take, and not having that being replaced over the years. When this facility was built in 1978, we didn't have the understanding that we do now about how to protect the buildings repeatedly with fire. If you start new with that, you obviously will do it differently, and you can have a 50-year lifespan on a structure because we've learned how to protect those structures. Even the classroom building, the design of it, it takes a lot of water. It's got a flat roof. There's been ongoing mold issues, as you can see in the photos there. There's a lot of things that happen with the lack of storage where now we understand that cancer prevention is a big part of what's going on in the fire service, and realizing that our gear that we take back to stations and just having it in the stations with us can be a huge source of carcinogens that's leading to high frequency cancers. Same thing's happening out there at the training facility where those things are just stored together. You also have an issue of what we see a lot of places where you have a rapidly growing community, built a facility, it was state-of-the-art at the time, a big investment at the time, but now we've continued to grow and the facility has not kept up with that growth. These photos that you see, and you'll see in the report, are some examples. When we realized that most firefighters were dying of heart attacks, fitness became a big part of that. And so when you have academy classes go through, you want them to have that instilled in them early on. To accommodate that at the existing facility, they took over half of their already small classroom space, and you see fitness equipment in there on a classroom right next to the classroom space. And they're very limited on the amount of classes that they can do simultaneously out there. And obviously you wouldn't design a fitness center that has that carpeting and those kind of things in there. You also see the storage of gear right where you have vehicle exhaust, and it's something that you're doing in your stations now, and it's certainly not something you want to do out there. The burn tower, the first time I think we all went into it hoping there was going to be lots of redeeming qualities with minor repairs that we could build on so that the investment went on building new things. We very rapidly realized that the structure was in really bad condition. In fact, so bad that it had some serious concerns. Just initially, the eyeball test said there's some really dangerous things here because of the condition of the structure. Robbie's report on that, as well as another agency that report on that, there's some structural deficiencies in that to the point that they can't burn in it anymore. They're not allowed to use it for the things. There's falling pieces of concrete coming off the building. We found that the burning in the facility takes place everywhere except for the one place that actually had some design features to deal with that. But again, it wouldn't have mattered with the way those designs, they just don't have the lifespan that we see. So obviously it would be done differently today, and an important factor of that, beyond just the state, the condition of that, is that we understand that what we used to do really well is teach firefighters how to climb stairs. So all the things that you know of as a burn building or a fire tower, all over the country you see this piece of concrete with this big tall tower in there, and it simulates nothing but a set of stairs. And so now we understand that that's not the best way to prepare them for high-rise facilities, for apartment complexes, for hotels with many doors in there. And so it has a limited functionality even if it was in a good state of repair. The range itself does not have baffling. So there's two kinds. This is what we call a blue sky range. So it's open to the sky in there. And there's two places, two kinds of ranges that are blue sky. There's the ones that have had an exit of a projectile, and there's the ones that have had an exit of a projectile. So we can tell you that we didn't go out and search for it in there, but we know from past experience that when you have an open range there, things get out. They ricochet off the walls, they ricochet off of rock in there, and things get out. And across the country, we see even ranges that have been established for a long time are getting shut down because when the neighbors move in and they find something out there when they're turning up dirt, they don't care how long you've been there. If you're the one person that's one random shot, it's a big deal, obviously. Plus, it doesn't have a lot of the modern targeting systems that allow us to address modern policing. And we talk a lot about, most bad guys don't stand there and say, hey, I'm going to stand right here, you stand right there and shoot me. All right, we're good. That's not how that happens. There's a dynamic environment, people are running, there's cover involved with it, and so the range has some deficiencies in teaching that understanding in there. And then one of the biggest things with the range is the lead safety concerns. We know with great detail now that even just being a range master or operating at a range without proper ventilation and airflow in there is a serious health hazard, has serious regulatory impacts on a body that doesn't recognize those. And there's a lot of concerns there with the airflow, the runoff in the range. You can see it's closed off on one end. So even though it's open air, it's not taking away the air from the respiratory zone of the shooter. And then you have the open sky. And then I have a little picture there of a couple of the bullet holes that I don't think they were aiming for that part of that, but it doesn't matter where you go, they're going to have some of those things involved. The site was one of the biggest negatives that we saw about the facility. As you know, it's on the airport. They have for many years struggled with access to that. Their only access to the facility is through the National Guard and through their security. All that has to be approved for that. It also then takes them out on a road that has direct access to an active runway, which is not advised for many reasons. Even, we don't feel like that there's a concern that someone's going to do something intentionally, but across the country, airports struggle with, somebody's a new driver, they get on the wrong runway, they get on the wrong path, and there's serious consequences of that. Usually it's just a matter of time before that magnifies in that. What we think happened there is that these things worked well when it was a smaller community and things were starting out. The documents that establish those agreements are pretty vague in what they lay out that is going to happen there. But as we talked with the FAA consultant, they have concerns that there's not an operational agreement that specifically says who can be on there, what their qualifications to drive, what the training to be accessing the airport is there. They had concerns that it appears that the security for that facility has been deferred to the National Guard, which the National Guard probably did not intend for that to be their operational procedures. And we met with all those groups, all of them very supportive, but we found that there was not a workable solution because of the aircraft zones that are existing out there that the FAA requires that they maintain, plus the security requirements. And at any given time, if they lock down the base, then that would lock down the access to the facility as well. It also limits the ability to involve the community in it. Most active training centers, the community comes out, they see what people are doing, they participate in community events there. You bring in outside agencies, and it's very limited at their existing facility. So the results of the needs analysis that we determined were important for them to look at is that if you're going to make an investment, whether it be at the existing site or a new site, and the types of things that we propose in here that we know address training, it doesn't make any sense for this to be a standalone facility. So the trend in these successful operations is joint police and fire facilities. And the reason that happens is we understand that if we build a realistic environment, if it looks like the community, then it serves both of them really well. It's the fire hazard that they have. It also allows police to do room clearing. They can do hostage situations. Everything that they would want to do and have to acquire structures for are served by both of these operations. A realistic environment is very key to good training. Again, we found over the years that we were really good at teaching individual skills, but where we were having trouble in after action reports is they didn't communicate, they didn't put it all together. Police and fire couldn't coordinate in there. It comes up in every report. And we finally started saying, well, why is that? How can we address that? And it's by giving them the ability to practice that in an environment that closer resembles that. And then obviously the advantages of improved access. These are a couple of projects we just want to show as an example. The one on the top is in the DC area, and the one in the bottom is in Owasso, just outside of Tulsa. But this is what we try to do, and it's different for every community, but we look at their hazards based on their study, and then we try to recreate them. In the top one, you can see there's a simulated school there, so they can do active shooter with police and fire. They have apartment complex, residential structures, a bank. In the bottom, it's a smaller community. They have residential structures that match those. The streets match. The park benches and lights and obstructions and everything are all trying to make it as close as possible so that they can do a full-scale scenario going through all their skill sets in there. The recommendations for facilities based on what we saw, obviously they've outgrown the classroom space, and the classroom space is in really poor condition right now. So we think that's important. All these pieces, and across the department, we see that hands-on is what was most important. Everybody said if we prioritize this, we want it to be something that we can directly apply that to the job. But each one of those then requires some type of support from a classroom space. Growth space, an obvious thing, and then looking at the range, clearly that's something that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. Again, there's a lot of development that's happening around there on the backside. My expectation based on previous projects is when they start turning dirt, somebody finds a few things, then you'll start getting calls about, hey, there's things getting out of this, and then it becomes a bigger problem. We recommended a new burn tower that would not look like what you have now, but be closer to what you see in a lot of the hotels and things that you're seeing building in the area. And that's where we get, that's where people get hurt, because there's lots of rooms, double loaded stairways in there. And those are the types of events that we see impact responders in a negative way, and then also the community. So we want them to be able to duplicate that. The two-story residential is the bread and butter of what they do. So a lot of times we forget, say, hey, they make a lot of house fires, or they make a lot of calls at a two-story house or one-story house. But what we see is that they don't necessarily get to go through the things that make them better at doing that. They're just reacting to the event. It's not a great place to be learning the job. And as the transition in the workforce has happened, we have a lot more people coming into the fire service and the police service that will never face the volume of incidents that they did 20, 30 years ago. We used to have a lot more fires. They're just as deadly, if not more, but you don't have as many opportunities. And a lot of people learned the hard way on the job. That ability to do that is gone. And so there has to be something that fills that void in there. So we want to be able to duplicate that as much as possible. The two-story mixed use would be something that would look like that first picture you saw, that would duplicate more what you see in the downtown here and allow them to address that mixed use in there. And then a lot of the props that they have there, we would see those being reused. Those are like the rail car and some of the industrial tanks that you have out there. But we would propose that they get put in an environment where you not only deal with that one individual skill, like plugging up a container, but you're looking at how do we evacuate this apartment complex that's right next to that? How do we deal with the runoff? How do we deal with the coordination between police and fire, controlling traffic in there? And those are the things that have an impact. A new driving course right now, that I believe they use the fairground. It's not designed for that. It doesn't allow them to teach some of their high-risk maneuvers like pit maneuvers. They have to go to other places to do that. And so that would be a purpose built that would allow them to have skid control, low water crossings, those type of things. And then the USAR environment that you've seen out there that looks like a bunch of rubble that's just kind of been piled up there, that's basically a bunch of rubble that's been piled up there. And that's how we've done USAR environments for a long time. And what's happened recently is we start seeing events where those are not engineered. We don't know when the next piece of concrete that's put on there is going to collapse one of those tunnels or something. And there's been incidents where we've collapsed those piles because no one was able to manage what was actually going on. So what you're seeing in the picture on the right there is what we would do. We would start with a structure that's engineered, and then they would weigh the material as it's added to that, so we'd always know that it was within the engineering parameters of that. We also looked at options for what we would base our recommendations on, looking at alternative training facilities. You are very, very limited in quality training facilities in the area, and it's mostly because of the density. Usually having a larger department or sets of departments is the only way people can approach these, and it's hard for smaller communities to be able to build something like this, and so there's just not a lot out there. Those that are out there look pretty much like what you were building in 1978. We looked at repair and upgrading the existing facilities. There was going to be high costs associated with the repairs. It was not going to address the functionality of the facility. It was going to be designed like it was in 78. It would just be repairing it. And then we really struggled with the access issues out there. That's an ongoing problem that we saw firsthand. We waited in line at 8 o'clock in the morning to get in a meeting behind a bunch of other people while staff members are waiting for us. It's cumbersome, and it has a cost associated with it. And then the last one, which is our recommendation, is to find a new site for a joint fire-police training facility that maximizes those usage. We look at that as something that where you share, you're not building duplicated classrooms, you're not building duplicated tactical village and burn buildings, you're combining those things. Focus on developing realistic training, offer programs to other agencies, successful programs now, do both public and private, whether it be confined space entry for one of the local manufacturing companies, looking at outside agencies who can't afford to build a facility to come in, and look at some cost offset of operation of that program by bringing in outside agencies. That's my presentation, and I'll be glad to take questions after Mike's done.
Good afternoon. Mike Montgomery with ESCI, a longtime firefighter, and most recently the fire marshal for a large metropolitan area. My educational background is in business administration, so I'm looking at all of these things from a cost-effective standpoint, as well as public safety and life safety. So we've already looked at these 4 basic questions, so we'll pass right past those, and we'll look at these. First thing I want to say is it really is an honor to do this project and come in and look at the the service delivery of both the Sioux Falls Fire Rescue and also the Sioux Falls Police Department. Start with the fire department. And first, the department and Sioux Falls, the community, you're to be commended in what you've built and what you've accomplished over the years. And just very briefly, the ones that really just jumped out to us, first and foremost, are the fire loss comparison. The number of fires, the number of casualties, the fire loss in dollar, but the number of people that have been injured or lost their lives in Sioux Falls is extremely low when compared to other communities of similar size, not only in this region, but across the nation. Part of that is because you've gone after superior fire service, and that's reflected in an ISO community classification of 1, which is the best that's available. But more importantly than that, it's the way that the fire department approaches its day-to-day job, its activity, which is saving lives, protecting property. And that's reflected in the customer satisfaction ratio surveys and has been for years. Finally, we found that when we looked at helping the department to develop a strategic plan, we found that the strategic plan that's already in place already looks at the past, it looks at the present, but most importantly, it has a very good plan that supports the comprehensive development plan for Sioux Falls and the outlying communities. We looked further into the fire department overall operations. We found that peak load staffing, especially in the downtown areas around Station 1, Station 5, does have some challenges in there. The fire department is already beginning to address these, and we had 100% cooperation from all ranks within the fire service when we looked at this. So some of these things are already being taken into account. Station coverage in outlying areas is always going to be a challenge in rapidly growing areas. Sioux Falls is no exception to that, and we see this especially, well, surrounding the city because you're expanding in all directions. Public outreach and risk reduction is the new poster child of the fire service, community risk reduction, but it has great realities. As Tommy said earlier, fires are not what most fire departments respond to the most now. In fact, fires are about 10% or less of the actual response volume within Sioux Falls Fire Rescue. Most of that response is emergency medical assistance and other related assistance. And again, these are just things that need to continue to be well-funded, well-staffed, even though they may be outside of the traditional purview of what some people perceive as the fire department. And then finally, there's a need to look at dispatch processes. That process is also well underway, both on the fire side and on the police side. When we looked at the overall surrounding area, we looked at population density and population growth. You know, over the last few years since the 1990 census, Sioux Falls has grown at an average rate of about 4.5% per year, annual growth rate. Fire department calls for service have mirrored that. So on the surface, it looks like the department and the population growth are well in hand with each other. However, I do want to draw your attention to the lower right-hand right-hand graph. The last 3 years, you'll notice that the calls for service is not only increasing faster than the population rate, but it's increasing at an increasing rate. And that simply means that more citizens are relying on the fire department to do more every day. One of the questions that we got asked to look at is there an economic value to a superior ISO classification? And the answer is yes. It's not large on an annual basis, but there is some value that is for the public, and this is in the form of reduced insurance premiums. Now, again, insurance premiums are set by the individual insurance companies, so there's no way to really accurately predict what the savings will be year on year, but this is our best estimation based on information provided by ISO and several of the insurers that are working here in the area. The key thing I wanted to point out this afternoon, if we look at the current conditions and service delivery of the fire department, is if you look at the fire calls for service, they're pretty much clustered around 2 general areas. The downtown area, and then over toward Falls Park, and then over in the southwest side of the county where we've got a lot of commercial upgrowth, and then just a lot of infill growth as well, residential. This is very typical. We see patterns like this across the United States, very active central core, and then 1 or 2 areas of outlying calls for service density. On the right-hand side is a graph that illustrates the time it takes for the Sioux Falls Fire Rescue to provide an effective response force. And the goal is to have the entire community either be in the blue region or the green region. As you can see in the outlying areas, especially to the east and to the south, that the fire department, there is a need for some additional coverage in those areas. So what we finally came up with was our priorities. We identified them, or we really need to be looking at new station coverage, primarily on the east side of the city, and what we call stations 12 and 13. These would be new facilities that are located, as you can see, on the far east side of the facility. Also, future considerations as the city continues to expand. We came up with several options that we noted in the report. One, for example, was to relocate Station 11. Station 11 is a relatively new station. It's in an outlying area. It's in a rapidly growing area, and that may be something that it'd be very costly to consider relocating that station. However, there is a need for additional coverage to the north along the 29 corridor, up north of the airport and west of the airport, where the new research center is going in and where we see some big box construction going in. So in those particular areas up there, rather than relocate Station 11 at some point in the future, that may be a new Station 14. Again, those considerations would be for council to look at development, potential land use, and population growth and need. So those are out in the future. We believe that it's our recommendation that using these recommended additional facilities, Stations 11 and 12, or sorry, 12 and 13, that we can really provide the coverage and build this effective response force that we looked at earlier. If you look at the left-hand side of this particular graph, you can see that to the east and to the north, it's difficult for the fire department, just simply from terms of distance from the fire station, to get up there within 8 minutes or less. By adding these two additional stations and by considering a current station in the north side of the community, if you'll notice, both the travel time is very good coverage for the entire city now, plus outlying areas for additional growth, but it also provides that effective response force in a shorter time, which translates into better protection for the community. With regard to the police report to work location, again, we found several things that the police department needs to be proud of: the lab accreditation, the community-oriented policing, and the evidence handling that are currently in place. So it's very important when we're looking at new report to work locations that we don't lose. We must be able to sustain those three things. So obviously our focus was on the need for additional report to work locations and where we can optimize those locations, how much time it takes for an officer after they gather, collect, and do preliminary processing of evidence at the scene to get that back to the evidence collection facility for safekeeping, so we can maintain accountability and for evidence and property. We also found that there was a need for some additional improvement in the CAD data capture, but again, that process is well underway. A new CAD system's been purchased. It's been online for approximately a month, and we're already seeing additional quality data that's coming out of that. Back to the service area again. On the surface, it looks like the population growth is faster than the calls for service for police, but yet if you look at, especially over the last 2 years, the year-on-year increase for calls for service is not only growing faster than the population is growing, but it's growing faster than it was the year before. So it's increasing at an increasing rate. The bulk of these calls for service are in the other categories. So these would be things outside of your major property and personal crimes. We looked at the police calls for service. We found a calls for service pattern that mirrored that of the fire department, but you notice a couple of additional hot spots along the 229 corridor there to the south. And this is not unusual. These are relatively high commercial and high density housing areas where we see those hot spots. But one thing that it did notice is that the travel time from headquarters gets longer and longer as you get farther away from the community center. So this suggests that there's a need for the ability to have temporary evidence storage and also write report to work locations in other parts of the city. The other thing that's important here is the downtown headquarters basically is just it's at capacity. There's no more room. And so we need to be able to see if we can move some of those officers out of that downtown facility so that we can make room for some additional support activities as necessary. So the next slide that you're going to see here are two examples of a recommendation. And wherever possible, we'd like to recommend that people look at co-located locations, both with fire and law enforcement working together. The first slide that you see here on the left-hand side is co-locating at Fire Station number 4, and you can see what an effect a positive effect that's had on travel time. And then downtown in the future, when we look at stations 12 and 13, have another report to work location on the far east side. We also realized in our study that space is a challenge at Station 4, and it may not be the most feasible location to co-locate at this time. So we also looked at Station 6, and we're going to continue to work with fire and law enforcement as they work together to see which of those locations has the best impact and for them. And with that, that concludes my presentation, and we'll be glad to take any questions.
Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, so I'll just do a few and then defer. I'll just start with kind of the last thing that was touched on first. I have to admit and maybe you can help me, and I have to apologize. I think the study went online in the last few days. I haven't had a chance to read it. I think it's large. I have to admit being a little puzzled by what I just heard about first of all, the travel times for the police, because, you know, it's not as if in our police department they sit at the office downtown, get a call, and drive out there. You know, they have their beats and their regions of the city, and having done a ride along, it's just, they're just zipping around, and they're in the area. So, and we had a discussion in the recent election about precincts and whether or not that would be beneficial or not. And when we talk about report to work locations, I mean, right now, my understanding and what I've seen is the police report to work for their shift. They might, you know, have a little briefing with the shift commander, get in their car, and then for the next 8 hours or whatever, they're in their car. So that I guess I'm just puzzled by the travel time from headquarters, whether that really means anything here in our city, whether that's, and are you proposing that we should be doing precincts?
No, let me, in case I misled you, I certainly didn't mean to do that. The travel time comes into play only when transferring evidence from an outlying area to downtown headquarters. Because the police department has a beat approach, that is neighborhood-based delivery, community-oriented policing, you're absolutely correct, the officers are in their beats. So that travel time is simply the time it takes when collecting evidence. And that can be any kind of evidence, whether it's drugs or firearms or money or things like that. And it's very important, especially those three, drugs, money, and firearms, that 100% accountability is maintained at all times. And so there's some great challenges from the legal system that we need to make sure that we do that right every time. So that's the only illusion to travel time that we have there, and that would be the to and from. As far as the beats themselves goes, that was instituted about a year ago, and that appears to be extremely effective so far, that and the staggered schedules. So it's not as if you have during report to work times where you've got a reduction in police protection in the communities. I certainly didn't want to suggest that in any way. The police department is doing that operationally. Having remote report to work locations simply simplifies and streamlines the reporting process, like you say. It's not a full-fledged precinct recommendation or anything that suggests that. It's just getting those police more involved in community-oriented policing so that they can, as they go through their beats, and stay in their cars.
So then for chain of custody and for evidence, are they driving it to a remote location and there's a secured locker or something where it's being placed and then it's being taken somewhere else later? I mean, I'm trying to just envision how.
No, it appears that everything is going downtown. No, everything.
In your proposal, what would happen?
In our proposal, there is the ability to do that, but that's why it's so important to design these facilities right. When we talk about a temporary evidence location, it can't be haphazard in any way. It has to have the same protocols, it has to have the same controls, limited access to where officers basically be no different than going downtown, other than it wouldn't be specific downtown. And then from time to time, that evidence would be collected and then transferred to the main evidence facility. The other option we looked at but did not recommend was that adding additional CSI officers or those trained as evidence technicians to basically just circulate around, because you can't guarantee when those people need to be required. They may be off shift, or they may be in another place in the county or the city, and so it just didn't appear to be as workable a solution as a co-located facility. And that evidence collection, that could be relatively small or relatively large depending on need.
Okay, last thing, and then I will defer. Did you look at, we have, my understanding is we have an evidence room, which I've been in years ago, that's busting at the seams, plus we have evidence in another building, the Gray Bar building. Was it looked at whether or not we need to increase capacity or do something else? I mean, we're holding evidence for years at a time for legal purposes.
Looking at that specifically was outside the scope of this project. It's certainly something that we can do, we've done before.